Okay, good evening all. Welcome to this lecture session. The topic for today's lecture is Fostering Compassionate Tibetan Nationalism and the Middle Way Approach to Success. As it seems, the rain has affected our attendance for the session today, so I apologize to the speaker. Before we proceed with the session, I would like to give a brief introduction of the chairperson for the session, Dr. Kaveri Gill. Dr. Kaveri Gill is an associate professor, Department of International Relations and Governance Studies, Shivnadar University. She completed a BA Tripost, MPhil, PhD, and postdoctoral SMUTS fellowship at the University of Cambridge, United States.
Kingdom.
Kingdom. Oh, I'm sorry.
But the MIT is also.
Kaveri has more than 15 years work experience with a range of institutions, including academia, government, multilateral and bilateral donors, international organizations, and development consultancies. I will hand over the session to you, but before that I would like to make a few announcements to the people present here. Tibet House organizes such lectures and programs on a monthly basis. We have a spectrum of lectures, conferences, teachings, and all sorts of things. So those who are interested can visit our website, or you can leave your email address and contact number outside. So we'll notify you whenever we have such events. So Kaveri, please take the session ahead.
So, Tashidelik, and welcome this evening. The last part of my bio, I'm also a student of the MA Nalanda Buddhist Philosophy with Venerable Geshe Dorji Damdullah, very important part of my bio. So to introduce the speaker, Dr. Nawang Phuntsog is a professor of education in the Department of Elementary and Bilingual Education at California State University at Fullerton. He is a Fulbright Nehru Research Scholar to India for the year 2017-18, and he was just saying he has been in Dharamsala and working at the LTWA for his research. So he is exploring the intersection of compassion-based inner values, secular ethics, the middle way approach for resolving Sino-Tibetan issues, and the compassionate Tibetan nationalism in the exiled schooling process. So he has published widely in several peer-reviewed journals, including the International Journal of Multilingualism, the Diaspora, Indigenous and Migrant Education, and Intercultural Education. So today, as Nawang mentioned, Dr. Nawang Phuntsog will be speaking about fostering compassionate Tibetan nationalism and the middle way approach to success. This is a very critical topic, I think, with a lot of Tibetan youngsters, very close to His Holiness's vision. And in this presentation, Professor Nawang Phuntsog will highlight the importance of exploring the notion of Tibetan nationalism, and then offer a tentative structure of Tibetan nationalism as well as its definition. The presentation will then examine the intersection of Tibetan nationalism and the middle way approach for resolving the Sino-Tibetan issue. Finally, he will share his current research study with its tentative findings. So welcome everybody, and over to the speaker.
Check. I hope it's clear. Yes. Okay. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Tibet House Director, Geshe Damdullah, and also the staff members of Tibet House for organizing this talk for me. And I actually enjoyed my talk last year, and so I wanted to pursue the same, interest this year as well. And so I emailed, I think, the secretary, and she was gracious enough to communicate with Geshe-la, who then accepted my proposal. So here I am. I flew from Bangalore this afternoon. It took 2 hours to get to New Delhi. But my taxi from the Delhi airport to my residence here in east of Kailash took 3 hours. It took longer than my flight. So I would say Delhi has a horrendous traffic situation, far more worse than Los Angeles, which is actually known all over the world for this kind of traffic situation. And then Nawang made an observation saying that we have very few, people in attendance today. But I'm not at all worried. In fact, less is more. So, I think the quality counts more than the quantity. So, those of you who are here, you are truly interested to explore this, topic of Tibetan nationalism, and that's the reason you are here. So, thank you very much for being here. So, let me begin my presentation. And before I do that, since I'm actually talking on the topic of Tibetan nationalism, it seems it's very important for me to say a few words in Tibetan language, because language is such an important, critical aspect of nationalism. So if I don't say something in Tibetan language, you might think, I'm not being very authentic in terms of my research. So could I say a few words in Tibetan language? Ene tanda ngenji na shu na shije tsabe pube geshin tol ya nya kamishu sonza ene pega tol tes ma shu na tes kharsule tikura jung mendo yine ta maumba nye ki kerishe kharsota pecho pega na she tuyage na rewa gebi en kainsen mi mangu dinde sungu to anenge kerishe de pübe geshin tol sonza püge tol ya she tubina peji yanchi karso pümi deba yor tundu yor dindelia tuben so yungri samkili samja shume dene chung dinde sonza maung bolanga püge na she ki dende nga pesu shuyin en zalanga arina ya wo mau shuj peji sumjul khaderu chigtu pagalab che desene inji kure tol ya ge shegirsa 직 벽에 돌아야 셴데 웹인데 사원네 셴데도 요된 양직 치드 삼삼직 직 갈수 디로머지로 치기도 이내 텐상 감소 치드 마우샤도 제가 치드도 양선에서 슈든서 발로치 지전에 저게 직대스 레라치라 신샤다 로치니나레 뭐만 퓨슈로브나 데즈네 퓨시다야고요 냥아지다 티수요 엔타나시 가수 따지 티에 저기 좀 개서는 하셔야고요. 엔테나가 어릴 친제 비 콜리아 표준당에 참여 친제 로망 쉬우친수 딘더송자 표현한 쉬어 참석하고 싶어도 에네 랭게스 공감해터네 당한 인제 토리아 쉬우이. So tonight my presentation would include 3 sections. The first section I'm offering actually as a way to offer a context to my presentation. I think the context is very, very important because context kind of like defines your presentation. If I were doing an actual empirical research, then this would be part of my literature review. When you're doing a research study, literature review is so very important because it is here you actually learn as much as possible about the topic that you're interested in. Without actually undertaking a thorough literature review, then you won't be really placed in a good position to undertake serious empirical research. Since there are no actual empirical research studies done in the area of Tibetan nationalism, I'm actually really compelled to read a lot of books that may be related to Tibetan nationalism, either directly or indirectly. So I'm going to share some of those things with you tonight as a part of my presentation. So I like to begin my presentation sharing with you a couple of quotes, just to highlight the importance of Tibetan nationalism. And then this will take me to my next part of my sort of like background presentation. That is, I'm going to share with you a very interesting module that may be applied to the process of really Tibetan identity construction. And then I'm going to really talk a little bit about this issue of applicability of nation and nationalism to Tibetan situation, because Tibet is an occupied country. And so when I began my project on Tibetan nationalism, I wasn't really sure, conceptually whether I would be able to apply this notion of nation and nationalism itself to Tibetan situation. So I did some research, and I'm going to share with you that will clearly establish the fact that we can easily apply the idea of nation to the Tibetan context. And then there are a lot of scholars, who would say since the occupation of Tibet, and then thereafter this cultural revolution which took place in Tibet from 1966 to 1976, they would say there is in fact a rupture, lack of continuity, particularly in terms of literary practices that would reflect Tibetan national identity. So I hope I will be able to challenge this rupture narrative through my presentation. So that is my sort of like third part of my background context. And then I'm going to share with you a tentative structure of Tibetan nationalism and a definition, because I think it's very important to have a sense of what this Tibetan nationalism looks like in a graphic representation, and then of course a definition. By all means, I'm not suggesting that these are like, just fully sort of like, blown type of situation. No, it's very tentative. And then second, I'm going to share with my current research, which actually looks at the intersection of middle way approach, secular ethics, and Tibetan nationalism in the schooling context. So my really primary interest comes from this notion of exploring the role of schooling in the production and manufacture of nationalism in general, and then of course Tibetan nationalism in particular. So that is really my interest. So I want you to be very clear that I'm not a Tibetan studies expert, nor am I a politician. My interest really comes from this educational sort of like perspective. How do schools actually harness, this structure of feeling associated with nationalism? And that is sort of like my primary interest. And then hopefully I get to show you some children's drawing and things like that. Okay, so my first quote is from late Professor Nawang's work. He wrote a book called Culture and the Politics of Third World Nationalism. So in this book, he shares this observation that unless and until we pay attention to the concept of nationalism, there is a great danger that this Sleeping Beauty might turn out to be a monster at some point. He made this observation in 1992. But of course, he did not make a direct reference to Tibetan situation. But he being a Tibetan, my hunch is that he was really thinking of Tibetan situation when he made this observation in 1992. And then second quotation comes from Shokthung, that is his pen name, and his real name is Takya. He wrote a book called The Division Between Heaven and Earth. So I read his, book in English translation, and he shares this observation in his book. He is making references to Han nationalism, since Tibet is under the Chinese occupation, and then he's also making the second reference to Tibetan nationalism. So he makes this observation based on his analysis of this 2008 protest that took place in Tibet, actually all over Tibet. So he studied all those sort of like protest-related issues, and he came to this conclusion, or he made this observation, saying that unless and until Chinese pay attention to their nationalism, as well as the Tibetans pay attention to our nationalism, it is quite possible that these two nationalisms might collide with each other. leading to some very negative consequences. So, these two actually quotations clearly establish the fact that it is very important for us at this point in time to pay attention to Tibetan nationalism. Then look at this, somewhere there. In Tibet, there has been a resurgence of Tibetan nationalism, particularly following 1980s. The liberalization of policies which took place in Tibet. And then this wonderful scholar from England, Lama Jup, he makes this observation, because he studied, actually, he analyzed very, very thoroughly oral and literacy practices in Tibet, particularly during the Cultural Revolution and, before that as well. And he analyzed, and he really studied how do the Tibetan writers express their Tibetan nationalism. And so he said this was really a watershed movement in rekindling Tibetan nationalism in Tibet. So that was in 1980s. Then I began to wonder, what have we done in exile? Really, there hasn't been any serious research or no discussion on Tibetan nationalism, which is really very disheartening and disappointing, to say the least. Hence, really, there is a serious lack of research on Tibetan nationalism. And I think we have a lot of, emerging, budding Tibetan scholars. And I hope some of you will really take on this responsibility to explore. And I tell you, it's a very exciting field as well. So hopefully through my presentation, I'll be able to inspire some of you. So now this takes me to this next part of my background presentation. I wanted to share this very simple yet elegant and versatile module that may be really, used as a framework to study the production of Tibetan national identity or nationalism. Now, if you look at this, according to this module, there are two very important, interesting attributes. One is called the commitment. So the commitment means to what extent you strongly identify with your national identity or not so. So it could be, yes or no type. And the second attribute is called the exploration. Exploration has to do with whether an individual has interest, not only commitment, but interest to explore your roots, interest to explore your national identity. So when you intersect these two attributes, you actually end up with four steps or processes that can be actually used to analyze Tibetan national identity. So let me take you to this so foreclosed. So if you look at this, foreclosed means an individual has a very strong commitment. Yet he or she doesn't have interest to explore what it means to be, let's say, a part of being an Uzang, like from the region of Uzang or Amdo or, Kham, or on the basis of Tibetan schools of Buddhism, if you identify yourself as Sakyapa or Gilpo, whatever it is, you have a very strong identification with this particular school, but you really don't have interest to explore what it means further. So that is called foreclose. There are 3 provinces in Tibet, and we have 5 schools of, 4 schools of Buddhism, and then Phön religion. And Tibetans very strongly identify with one of these schools and Phön as well. And now, if we are actually only at that particular stage, if we don't take this exploration as the next step, my hunch is that if we all remain in this foreclosed situation, this could really, really undermine, the ability to achieve the goals of middle way approach. And imagine if this particular foreclosed status or situation continues in Tibet after we go back. Let's say we are able to achieve the goals of middle way approach, and we just go back. And if we continue to be in this stage, it will be a problematic situation. In order for us to move to the next phase. Now let's look at the second step, which is called diffuse step. An individual at this particular phase expresses neither desire to explore nor any commitment. He just might say, I'm a simple Tibetan. I don't care whether I'm from Kham or Amdo or whatever it is. I'm just a Tibetan. And of course, there's nothing wrong with this, nor there's any problem with the previous one foreclosed. But it's so very important to develop this interest, desire to explore, which is the next phase, which is called moratorium. Let's say you didn't have any strong commitment, but at least you have the desire to explore what it means to be a Gelugpa or Sakyapa or Kham or Yuzan, something like that. And that is a very important step. Like for my own case, I spent close to 2 months in Dharamsala reading books on Tibetan history, actually reading books on 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism. So I was more or less on a journey of discovery. Really, for me, this was a moratorium kind of like phase in my Tibetan national identity. Have I learned everything about Tibetan national? No, not at all. I'm just really beginning my journey. But it was a very useful journey for me. It was this, I explored a lot. I spent close to 2 months speaking with some experts and scholars and whatnot. So for me, that was really, this moratorium phase in my life. Now, this moratorium phase is so very important part of our, part of this Tibetan national identity construction. Because if you have the desire to explore, you will learn pros and cons and all kinds of stuff. And then this is likely to lead to the next phase, which is called achieved. So when you're at this achieved phase, your commitment intersects very beautifully with your exploration. So because if you look at this, it's both yes, yes, yes. So this is a very simple yet versatile and elegant module that can be really used to analyze. Let's say someone is doing some research, you ask children and adults and whatever it is. You have a lot of let's say data. So you can use this to analyze. Where do Tibetans really, where Tibetans stand in terms of their identity construction? Are they mostly at the foreclosed? Are they mostly at the diffuse or moratorium or achieved? Of course, if you end up 95% in the achieved, that means it's a very good prospect for us. So this is really a kind of very good module. Then I really struggled with this idea of whether we can apply this notion of nation and nationalism to the Tibetan situation, because Tibet is an occupied country. And so I had to read a lot of books, particularly works of Benedict Anderson. And he is considered to be this sort of like intellectual giant on nationalism. So anyway, let me first take you to Rousseau. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, a very well-known French philosopher. And really, he was the first one to challenge this elitist notion, this association of nation with ruling class, bourgeois type of situation. So before he challenged this elitist notion, the notion of nationalism was, primarily associated with, ruling class. That means the ruling class would sort of like determine the nation and nationalism of a particular country, because they were the literate, a group of a particular society. So he challenged that. And thereafter, people began to associate nation with people. And even Nawang says that since 1780s, the notion of nation is generally associated with people. No one actually has challenged this association so far, haven't come across at all. in my, readings up to this day. So then if you look even at the Latin word itself, nato means people. And then Anderson himself, he says nationalism is an imagined community with deep horizontal relationship, not vertical relationship. If it were vertical, it would be more like ruling class type of situation. So he makes this, very interesting, offers this definition. And then really, this is my favorite definition by, again, a French theorist and philosopher, Renan. When I was reading books on nationalism, I came across his name very frequently. He is referred so very frequently, and I began to wonder, what important work did he write, on nationalism? And he wrote a very short essay. It's called "What is a Nation?" And you can easily Google his name, and you'll be able to read his short article. I would say about two pages or something. But when he wrote this very, very famous, very well-known short article, and this short article, catapulted him into this sort of like, international prominence, so to speak. So people actually refer his name very frequently. And he actually defines nationalism as a soul and a principle. Principle with this rich collective memory rooted in the past, and this will, this desire to continue in the present and in the future. So really, his definition is aligns with our Tibetan, situation very well. So I made this observation that I think as a Tibetan, we all have this, the will to live as a community to sustain the rich Tibetan cultural heritage in an undivided three provinces. And even he uses the term in 1823, undivided. Almost he was prophetic in terms of the choice of the words in that particular period. So I was, so happy to apply his sort of like notion to the Tibetan situation. And there's a nice fit as well, because he emphasizes the spiritual aspect of nationalism. So I think that's what I'm actually trying to emphasize in my research as well. This altruistic dominated Tibetan nationalism. And then he makes the other, observation that suffering in common unifies more than the joy. I think this is very true. If you think of this recent tragic situation that occurred in Tibet, like with regard to self-immolation, I think we all felt very sad, all of us, individually as well as collectively. And whenever we felt sad, I'm sure we are brought together as well. So let me go to the next one. This next one is very important actually to keep in mind. In fact, Dao makes the same observation. A nation may desire a state, but the lack of the state does not preclude the existence of nation. Now, this concept is very important for us, particularly in the diaspora situation. If you apply this concept to the Indian, colonial sort of like situation, India was under the British colonial rule for 200 years. During those 200 years, Indian nation was very much alive. In fact, nationalism was expressed very frequently, in the form of satyagraha, in the form of non-cooperation and things like that. While the Indian state was run by the British colonial rule. So that is a very important distinction to keep in mind. So, again, we can apply the same sort of like, concept to the Tibetan situation. The Tibetan state is being run by the mainland China. Yet the Tibetan nation, am I right, is still alive. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. Let me move to the next one very quickly. So then, Dao, I actually read Dao's book, I would say almost 3-4 times. because that is most relevant book for me. His work on culture and the politics of third world nationalism actually, really resonated with my interest. So when I read his book, he actually defines the functions of culture that would promote nationalism. And so, he identifies 4 actually elements or attributes of culture that are likely to lead to the development of nationalism. So I'm just, since my interest is on Tibetan nationalism, I use this framework as a way to really study about Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion, in terms of, looking at the relationship between Tibetan culture and Tibetan nationalism. And of course, Tibetan culture and Buddhism, they are the 2 sides of the same coin. The 4 attributes of culture. One is the presence of prominent religious text, and of course we have plenty of prominent religious text. The 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, each school has their own very unique text. So this kind of like fulfills our one aspect of the dimension, and then galaxy of cultural heroes. And of course, when I started this project, I actually had not a lot of idea in terms of, who could be like, part of these cultural heroes. We all know, of course, His Holiness and whatnot. But then when you read actually Tibetan cultural history, you'll be amazed. There are so many wonderful cultural heroes. And again, to know these cultural heroes is very important aspect of our national identity construction. So I'm going to share some of those. And then a national writing system. And actually, Tibet is so very fortunate to have one written system that is used all across 3 provinces. There are very few countries with this kind of a gift. So we have this very special gift from actually Songtsen Gampo and Thimi Sampura, in the starting from 7th century. And then collective social history differentiating from others. And of course, we have a very unique cultural tradition, which is kind of very much Buddhism-based, Buddhism-induced type of, culture, language, tradition, whatnot. So, so I really use these 4 elements as a way to really study the relationship between Tibetan culture and Tibetan nationalism. So now, so I went back as early as possible in order to really look at the important landmarks, that might actually help us to understand how did this Tibetan national consciousness begin to evolve in the Tibetan society. Early Tibetans, they developed a very strong relationship with nature, mountains, rivers, and they express the relationship through eulogies and as well as mountain worship practices. These 2 are very powerful ways of forging a strong relationship with the nature, with the mountains and things like that. When I read the works of Karme, Samdek Karme, he actually went to Tibet in somewhere 1990s to undertake an ethnographic research to study this kind of relationship between Tibetans and the nature. And so he says that there are a lot of actually documents, ancient documents, that would really include many of these eulogies, that would very beautifully describe the beauty, the wildness, the purity, the centrality of the mountains and rivers and whatnot. But this was the only one translated book, so I'm going to share with you at least one eulogy. Look at this. Tibet is high and its land is pure. Its snowy mountains are at the head of everything, the source of innumerable rivers and streams. It is the center of the spheres of the gods. And then, I looked at, what are some mountains that are of really important, symbolism for us, particularly from a national identity perspective. And there are so many mountains, just a couple of them I'm going to share with you. The first one is Mount Lerikanto in Kompo. This is of particular significance for us because it symbolizes, the fact that the first king of Tibet descended from heaven on this particular summit of the mountain. So, it has very special significance for all of us. Imagine the first king. He just descended very beautifully on the top of this mountain. And I actually wanted to find a picture or photo of this mountain, and I couldn't find at all. I'm not very sure. I have to do some more research because I wanted to share that photo with you, but I was able to get some more mountains. I'll share them with you later. Now, let me look at the second mountain, Yala Shampu in Yalung. Again, this is very significant for us. Has a huge national symbolism for us. This is significant because it is the ancestral deity of Yalung dynasty. And then it is also the ancestral deity of the early kings, I think, Songzhen Gampo, because he annexed, Shangshung sort of like kingdom later. And then is the ancestral deity of King Kesa. Then let's look at the next mountain, Mount Amnamachin in Amdo. Again, this is such an important mountain. It is considered to be the soul of Tibet. See, can you imagine you can grab the soul of Tibet when you go and touch this mountain? See, there lies the beauty of this kind of mount worship practices. The next one, for Kolok people in Amdo, this mountain is such an important mountain. So this is actually, Yala Shambu in Yalung from a Google image. And the next one is here. This is the Amne mountain. And actually, if you Google both of these mountains, you will come across a lot of beautiful images of these two mountains. You will find Tibetans doing prostration as they get closer to these mountains. And then, of course, you will see all these prayer flags just fluttering in the air. And then also you will find a lot of Tibetans burning incense. And I really like this idea of burning incense and actually hosting this kind of prayer flags. Very tangible way to express your, relationship with this kind of a topography. And then you can easily imagine, and of course, if I were able to do this in, incense burning practice in front of one of these, I would be so happy to touch the mountain at its foothill, and then burn an incense. Imagine my incense are flying up in the sky, and eventually it sort of like kisses the top of the mountain, and there I have established this real tangible relationship with the mountain. I'm like grabbing the mountain. So it's really such a beautiful image. So I kind of like enjoyed that a little bit, thinking and visualizing that, I'm in Tibet and I'm really touching this, Amne Machin and whatnot. Okay. So now, since I was telling you about these 4 attributes of culture, that would contribute to this nationalism production. So I did study a little bit, early period of growth of Buddhism. Again, it's very important to acknowledge that Pen is the indigenous, or was the indigenous religion of Tibet until, the introduction of Buddhism in the 7th century. And then, as I was telling you earlier, King Songzhen Gampo, he annexed Shangshung Kingdom in 643. And hence, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I was really kind of quite happy with the fact that this Yala, this Yala Shambu is considered to be the ancestral deity for early kings. He did not abandon the relationship. He rather continued, the relation even after the annexation of this this kingdom. Okay. Definitely the introduction of written script, as well as the rapid spread of Buddhism in early part of the history is, I would say, they are one of the most important national consciousness raising events in the Tibetan history. Because this written script, which was introduced in 7th century, ensured that we have one written system across all 3 provinces. And again, this written script, as well as the introduction of Buddhism, strengthened the Tibetan unity in early, 7th century. Then, definitely, Timisam Buddha and King Songtsen Gampo, these two are early cultural icons, heroes for us. What they did for the Tibetan nation is just totally amazing. Timisam Buddha, he went to India and he studied the Sanskrit and later developed this Tibetan script. I mean, can you imagine in the 7th century traveling in India? To this day, I find it very difficult to travel back, particularly in Delhi. It's so hectic, it's so crowded. I'm not very sure what was the condition in the 7th century. But really, he took this responsibility upon himself to travel to India, to learn Sanskrit and Buddhism, and then bring them back to Tibet. So to me, really, Timisam Buddha and Songtsen Gampo, they are 2 very important cultural icons. Who could really inspire all of us. And then Timisam Buddha is really very unique, at least in my perspective. He is a nationalist because he thought of introducing one script for all Tibetans. And then he was, again, a wonderful linguist. Who could have done this kind of work without being a linguist? Although this term linguist is a very recent terminology, but we can definitely apply it to Timisam Buddha. And then, again, he was an educator par excellence. When I was in 6th or 7th grade in the Tibetan school, I do remember reading a kind of a little stanza about Timisam Buddha. Actually, he himself wrote it. I hope I can recall what he said. Rang regla shimba kabu sim. Rang shu ying una never. Rang regla shabchi matimi kadi mejams. He said it like that. And again, this is a very clear expression of Tibetan nationalism. I love Tibet. Because of this love, I am so happy to serve the Tibetan nation. And haven't I done some kind of great stuff for the Tibetan people kind of thing? That's how we wrote in that little stanza. Okay, so let's move on. So then, this is particularly the early period of development of Buddhism in Tibet. And now we want to move to this next one, which is the later years of growth of Buddhism in Tibet. So during actually the 4 schools of Tibetan Buddhism, I find them to be very, very unique and interesting because they really add this indigenous dimension to the Tibetan Buddhism. And hence, they are, to me, very important sources of Tibetan national identity. And so we all really, must study as much as possible about these 4 different schools. And so when I read these 4 different schools, each one is so very interesting. There is a founder for each school. Not only there is a founder, but there are so many highly accomplished scholars who wrote just profusely on many different topics. And so, and of course, all of these accomplished scholars could be cultural icons for us very easily. And I think that makes a lot of sense because this is the indigenous aspect of Tibetan Buddhism. So as Tibetans, we must pay particular attention to this aspect of Tibetan Buddhism. Of course, I'm not suggesting that Nalanda aspect should be ignored, not at all. Along with the Nalanda, we must also pay attention to this indigenous aspect of the development of Tibetan Buddhism. So His Holiness Dekul Khyentse was asked by by an author who wrote actually a book on Tibetan culture. He was so very smart. He went to the primary source. He asked Dekul Khyentse Rinpoche to write a short history of Nyingma lineage. And so I read that section, and His Holiness has listed many scholars, the founders and whatnot. And so, I wouldn't have time to really highlight all of. Oh, am I running out of time?
I've lost track as well. It's a very good talk.
Oh, gee.
I think 5 to 7.
I think I have to rush really, but okay. So look at this Pothen. Again, you can actually Google Pothen and you can find a lot of information on Pothen. I was particularly struck by this Tibetan scholar Pothen because he was the first one to catalog and systematize this very rich Tibetan, text. Kangyur and thank you. I mean, really, it's just a wonderful contribution, wonderful cultural icon for us. And then I began to wonder, as you may be wondering at this point, when did this library cataloging system develop in the West? And then this gentleman, Melville Dewey, he, after 500 years later, he introduced this very unique sort of like cataloging system in the West. So I think that's also something very important for us to kind of have a sense. Pothen was really a forerunner, trailblazer in, cataloging system. I mean, how many of us actually know this fact? It's such a fascinating, discovery for me. And the next one is Tangdong Gyalpo. And again, he is such an interesting Tibetan cultural icon. Some scholars have called him the Leonardo da Vinci of Tibet. Some have called him the Wizard of Tibet. But whatever may be the titles, he is a very, very unique cultural hero for all of us. He actually gave us Tibetan opera, which we all enjoy, And again, the reason why he introduced Tibetan opera was not just merely to entertain the Tibetans. That was one, of course, sort of like his goal. But his intent was to integrate Tibetan Buddhism as a part of this entertainment. So he was so very creative, that Tibetans would not only be entertained through this sort of like Tibetan opera, but then your spiritual growth would be also enhanced. Well, what a creative individual he was. And then of course he's known for this building suspension bridges, 108. Imagine he built that 108. What a engineering feat actually at that time. So we have actually plenty of cultural heroes, really. There is no any shortage at all. So this is actually a Thanga image of Pothen. I hope it's not very clear. And then the next one is this thing, Tangdo Gyalpo. And again, if you Google both of these images, you'll find a lot of images. But I just kind of pulled two of these just to share with you all. So again, this with regard to Kagyu, Sakya. I think I would have time, so please, excuse me. And then with regard to Gelugpa, there are so many cultural heroes. Of course, prominent ones are Panchen Lama, successive incarnations of Panchen Lama, successive incarnations of Dalai Lamas. These are marvelous cultural heroes who would really challenge that. So now let me come, anyway, to really wrap up and sum up this like robust expansion of Tibetan Buddhism, particularly in the later period. I think, we could definitely call this as the golden period of Tibetan Buddhism, because it was during this period we saw this robust growth of literature, very rich literature. It was so very rich and so very robust. These two scholars, Snellgrove and Richardson, they called this as the apotheosis of Tibetan civilization. That means we have reached the highest achievement, scholastic achievement. What a kind of recognition. And so we should all feel very proud of this indigenous aspect of the Tibetan Buddhism. So I think let me move, so this is now coming down to this modern period. Definitely during the modern period, Tibetan national identity suffered greatly. Of course, we all know, after the Chinese occupation, it really suffered a lot because of all these destructions that took place, particularly during the Cultural Revolution. And there's one lady who actually traveled 4 times to Tibet to really document and to actually do a little bit of estimation. And Heather Student, actually she writes many articles. And so I pulled this information from her work. She says during Cultural Revolution, 95% of cultural sites of Tibet were destroyed, which is so very, sad. And then she cites one example. I thought that was sort of mind-blowing. So there's one library in Pempo, which is very close to Lhasa. It took 3 weeks to be burned down. So can you imagine, the magnitude of destruction that took place during those 3 weeks? This was a library. Anyway, we shouldn't feel very dismayed. And there's one interesting observation that Carmen makes based on his ethnographic research, having traveled to Tibet many times. And I actually got really inspired by what he shared in his work. The more there was repression, destruction in Tibet, the greater was the feeling of Tibetans to really maintain their cultural identity. And this is really very clear if you look at the works of Lama Jap, who has analyzed the works of Tibetan writers in Tibet, particularly during the Cultural Revolution, and thereafter. Very, very clear. And so my sense is during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of these cultural practices, they remained underground in order to escape attention from the officials. But doesn't mean that they disappeared. It doesn't mean there was a rupture or discontinuity. The continuity was not visible to the outside world, so to speak. But I think there was really a very robust interaction taking place. And I really want to remind you all of what Renan has said. Suffering bonds more than the joy. So imagine when there was destruction. I think the Tibetans in Tibet, they were bonded more. So anyway, Lama Jap also makes this observation though. The past oral and literary practices, they intersect with current dreams and aspirations and hopes of the Tibetan writers. And so this actually, Tibetan literature really provides a wonderful avenue for them to express their traumatic experiences, their joys, their hopes, their dreams, aspirations. And I think we have a very important responsibility, duty, to really read their works in order to establish this psychological link with them. Unless and until we do this psychological linking with them, imagine when we return to Tibet, we would be strangers in our own country. I think we don't want to get to that situation. So in order to prevent this being strangers in your own country, we must read their works so that we have an understanding of, what are the experiences they went through or going through as we speak today. So that is the way we can establish this sort of emotional link with them, this psychological link with them. So which is very important, really. Let me share just one poem, which is so very beautiful. The song my mother taught me. And look at this, the song my mother taught me. Clearly, he is talking about the past experiences that his mother has, taught him. So there's definitely a link between his current situation with the past. And he is actually a Chinese writer, Sinophone Tibetan writer. His name is actually Yidam Tsering, I think, but it's sort of like Sinusize kind of way of writing. He said, the world I was born in was a pure soil protected by Dharma. But at the door of the honest and kind-hearted, one could often hear the howls of the demon. What a powerful, point. He was so bold, audacious to express his true feelings. And, the world I was born in, that means he's referring to Tibet before occupation by the mainland China, was, kind of Buddhist country. But at the door of the honest and kind of, that means between, he's talking about the boundary between Tibet and China. One often hears the howls of the demon. This is a very powerful expression for someone to really, express his national identity. So again, this work is from Tunduk. Okay, now let me just talk a little bit about this, so before we wrap up. So if you read the works of Nawang, particularly his book on culture and the politics, third world nationalism, which is very, I would say, kind of like closer to our situation. Unfortunately, in this book, he never mentions Tibetan nationalism. For me, that would be a perfect situation for him to describe Tibetan nationalism, because Tibet is part of this third world. I mean, he studied so many other countries, particularly, with regard to their nationalism. And I was really kind of surprised he never mentions Tibetan nationalism. Although he talked so much about nationalism. His whole thesis was on nationalism. And other books that you read talk about nationalism all the time. But he really has not at all made an attempt to sort of like contextualize Tibetan nationalism within that third world situation. But anyway, speaking from a general perspective, he and many, of course, scholars, they would say there are two categories of nationalism. One is based on language, race, language, race, and territory, which is like the traditional classical type of category of nationalism. Other one is based on egalitarian nationalism, which is again based on like equality, fraternity, and things like that. So now, when I looked at this notion of the second category, egalitarian, and I really wanted to study this very clearly to see whether the Tibetan nationalism would fall into this category. But it really, didn't fit into that category at all. Because if you look at egalitarian, means equal benefits for both parties. Whereas Tibetan nationalism, as I have understood, based on my interviews, is really based on others before self. So it is really more than this equal situation. Egalitarian means equal. And then, of course, egalitarian concept is based pretty much on social justice issue. Is the primary sort of like driving force in terms of egalitarian concept. Whereas in the Tibetan nationalism context, it is the notion of altruism, others before self. The interest of others is more important than your own interest. what a very, powerful way of conceptualizing Tibetan nationalism. So that is why, I kind of created this third category, just to present the Tibetan national aspect really more clearly. So I added this third nationalism, altruism-based, transcendental, because it's truly like transcendental. It goes beyond one's own interest of nation and nationalism. Okay. So now this is really the structure of Tibetan nationalism. In general, nationalism has three components. One is tradition. Tradition provides a source of inspiration. That's why I really looked at those four schools of Tibetan Buddhism, early Tibetan history, and later and modern and things like that. Really, to get a sense of how do these cultural practices really, let's say, lead to the production of Tibetan national consciousness, Tibetan national identity, things like that. So tradition is definitely a very important source of inspiration for us. There's no doubt about that. So that's a very important part of the structure of Tibetan national. The second one is generally called as interest, current interest. From interest perspective, of course, in the diaspora, we have economic interest, educational interest, political interest. But to me, really reunification with our sort of long lost brothers and sisters might be one very important, dream and aspiration of all Tibetans. So that would be, again, a part of this interest category. And then the third one is ideals or ideology. So really, this middle way approach, for better or worse, at least provides an ideology for us. Without an ideology, it is very difficult to really develop a social movement that will lead to the production of nationalism. So if you really study Tibetan national consciousness and things like that in the past, really I did not get a sense that there was any sort of a development of some ideology in the past. Maybe that is one reason that we really didn't, we didn't develop a very strong sense of Tibetan nationalism in the past. So so this middle way approach is at least it is an ideology. It is a perspective that is providing us this social movement for us. And then of course this will lead to the next structure, which is altruistic transcendental nationalism, which is a pragmatic approach. Okay. So this is moving on to this next part of my presentation, that is a definition of Tibetan nationalism. Is a very tentative one, but again this is based on the readings that I've done, as a part of my research on nationalism. So Tibetan nationalism is the fusion of Buddhism-induced traditional Tibetan culture and the middle way approach ideology, with this culturally aligned altruistic capacity for fostering great social action and national consciousness for the greater good of all. I do see this possibility really, Tibetan tradition intersecting with this middle way approach as an ideology, and both of these coming together, particularly under the leadership of someone who is able to interpret the tradition, though. That's very important. Interpret the tradition in the current context so that he or she is able to forge this very powerful social movement that will lead us to a very robust production of Tibetan nationalism. So now, this is a culture-based, mass-mobilized nationalism. And so Nawang actually asks this question, not really pertaining directly to Tibetan situation, but he kind of again studied, for example, differences between mass religion-induced nationalism and state nationalism. That is, for example, in India, if you look at India as a case study, in the past, when India was under the British rule, religion played a very important, vital role in terms of, promoting nationalism. But once India gained independence, religion was a little bit kind of like, according to Nawang, pushed to the sort of like to the background, so to speak. Anyway, the Indian modern leaders, they developed new perspectives, new ideology. So then I began to wonder, would we need to develop a new sort of like ideology? Let's say if you go back to Tibet, once the middle way approach is realized. My actually sense is that a middle way approach, particularly that is based on altruism, transcendental type of ideology, will continue to be pragmatic, will continue to be functioning, because this is very transcendental. It is not kind of like confined to a particular nationalism. In fact, it can, it can help many other countries where there's so much conflict to sort of like take a lesson from this Tibetan situation. So, that is sort of like my, at least hunch at this point. So,
maybe if you, because then questions.
No, I think I'm going to end here. Just very quickly, yeah. I want to share just with you at least, otherwise, you might think I didn't do any research. But I interviewed very important individuals who actually played a very critical role in the formulation of middle way approach, secular ethics, and interviewed them at length. So this is not really the final sort of like, should I say, themes that I was able to glean from my interview, but a very tentative one. I'm still, some folks are transcribing my interview. But I was really very impressed, or should I say, I was very happy to find that none of those people I interviewed, they did not see any contradiction between all these three important perspectives that are so important to the Tibetan exile situation. Secular ethics, middle way approach, Tibetan nationalism. In fact, in their mind, they coexist so very beautifully in the Tibetan situation. In fact, each one reinforces the other perspective. Imagine, it's strengthened in the process. I never got this sense that there was some kind of contradiction. Of course, there was one scholar who said, if you look at the middle way approach, somebody might say, well, this really undermines the Tibetan nationalism at the superficial level. That is actually true. But if you really dig deep down, middle way approach is very much based on altruism. It's a kind of like win-win situation type. And so, again, it reinforces the Tibetan national rather than undermines the Tibetan nationalism. And again, this is very important observation they shared. Middle way approach is like secular ethics in action. Now, I think that is something very important for us to keep in mind. And also they said teaching compassion in the school will never undermine Tibetan nationalism, because there is some fear that, if you emphasize compassion, maybe you're less likely to develop this very strong sense of Tibetan nationalism. But that wasn't the case based on my interview. In fact, compassion will reinforce Tibetan nationalism, will in fact reinforce middle way approach, to kind of ensure that there's this win-win kind of situation there. So I'm sorry I took a very long time. I was planning to rush through my presentation, but it didn't happen. So I think I'll stop here in case you have some questions. I think that'd be good. Huh? I have a very kind chair. She didn't bother me at all. Okay. Thank you. So I end here.
Wonderful. So wonderful, Professor Nawang Phuntsog. This was a really wonderful presentation. And I see that you've been very busy in your research time in Dharamsala, because you presented previously and the research has developed a lot since then, and it's actually just fascinating. So the time ran away with me as well. So I'll open the for any questions from the floor. Yeah.
Professor Kaveri, my child, I thank you. His Holiness, my Emperor, doesn't come into the category of thank you. They're above everything. Professor, sir, you're a prince of Tibet, a professor. Everything is for the most elegant, beautiful, emotional talk I've ever heard, and I'm almost tangible with death. Next year, if I'm not here, it's just that I might be sitting in Tibet as a bird or as a snowflake.
On the top of Mount Yellowstone. That is the best place to be.
I wanted to thank you for the most beautiful, elegant talk I've ever heard. I've thanked Kabirji, Secretary, everybody. I wanted to say that many of my colleagues wanted to come here. The Delhi traffic,
it's horrible.
the inclement weather.
Yes.
On one of our very good members, he got raging 40-something temperature yesterday, and so 3 of them dropped out because of that. So it would have at least 15 more if Delhi traffic was less or rain was less. I am Tibetan. Professor, thank you. If we don't meet, I'll meet you.
No, we'll meet for sure. You look very young.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I don't need this. No.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
Professor, you mentioned about this mountains.
Uh-huh.
Probably you missed the Kailash mountain, which has a significance for our several religions also.
Uh-huh.
And one more observation is regarding a question you can call. You said that for nationalism, the state is not prerequisite. The vice versa is also true.
Right. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's true.
And in the last part is, Tibet has several schools of thoughts.
Buddhism.
And you said sorrows bonds together rather than joy.
Uh-huh.
So in the case of the several schools of thought, when they come for national interest, will they bond together or they have different views?
Well, so now, if they remain within their own sort of like schools of Tibetan Buddhism, so that would be called as a foreclosed Tibetan national identity construction. It is sort of like a part of the national, but it's not at its most, accomplished phase. That's why, I was trying to emphasize the fact that, one must develop this interest to explore. One must want to go beyond that sectarian sort of like identification or provincial basis of identification. And if one explores, then, you begin to identify with all the, 4 schools, even beyond. And, so that is why I was trying to emphasize the importance of exploration, because that will lead to the achieved phase, which is the end, sort of like, that's where we want to actually kind of move to. But otherwise, if you remain in the foreclosed, your identification is incomplete. It is at a very minimum sort of like level. You identify either with, with your sect or with your province or with your, or whatever you think is important in your life as being a member of a particular, cultural group. So that is really incomplete. So, so hence, in the schools, teachers can easily help children to explore what it means to be a Tibetan. It might begin with that sect, sort of like, sectarian sort of identification or provincial. But then that is really at its minimum. The more we explore, the more we are going to find commonalities. Differences may be there, but commonalities become more important than the differences. Otherwise, you emphasize only differences if you're at that folklore stage. Oh, I'm a Sakya, I'm a Gilipo, whatever it is, which happens very frequently. So I was trying to say that this kind of a identification will undermine middle way approach Tibetan nationalism. I hope I made that kind of link. Yeah. Thank you.
And regarding the mountain?
I know Mount Kailash is important for many different religions, Hindu, of course, and Buddhism. But to be very honest with you, in my readings, I haven't come across any special sort of but I know it's very important for the Tibetans. They actually travel all the way doing prostrations and things like that. So it's very important. But I have not been able to find a literature, that I could include as a part of a presentation. But I found more which are kind of based in Tibet itself. You know what I'm saying? Mount Amnemachin and Yalashambhu, and there are other mountains too.
Please give us
but I will
a
look,
presentation.
definitely. Yeah. Huh?
That would be a separate presentation on mountainous deity.
Yeah, I think it's very beautiful, really.
It's very
to explore this relationship stuff is so, that's how Tibetans express their love, fondness, for the local, geography. And that is why Tibetans are very unhappy when, Chinese, government comes and bulldozes a mountain or something. For them, this is, they are sort of like ancestor, deity, or their soul. It is just more than a mountain. It means so much for them. And then this so much continues from the past to the present situation. It's not a short sort of like history. And so, I can understand really why Tibetans are so upset when, Chinese government say, we want to, bulldoze this mountain so that we can unearth minerals or something of that kind. For the Tibetans, this is just such an important part of their life, actually. Existence. It is an existential issue for them. It's again, this is how they forged the relationship in a very concrete and, in a very powerful spiritual way. Hence, it's so difficult for them to give away this link. Yeah.
You had a question.
Sir, what makes Tibetan nationalism different from Indian nationalism?
Mm-hmm.
That one is my first question.
Okay.
And the second question, why are you not considering Tibetan nationalism as anti-colonial nationalism as Indian political scientist?
Mm-hmm.
Sudipta Kivras does in Indian context.
Anti-colonial.
Anti-colonial.
Uh-huh.
Anti-colonial nationalism.
Uh-huh. My primary interest actually, as I had, stated earlier, was to look at the intersection of secular ethics and a middle way approach and Tibetan nationalism. So that was my primary interest, and how this Tibetan nationalism is being inculcated in the schooling process. So that was my, and then when I looked at how children are being groomed and socialized these days, of course they're being taught, the schooling process integrates, this secular ethics and middle way approach and things like that. And then, of course, compassion is a very much part of their schooling culture. There's no doubt about it. It's part of the, they're very part of their life, really speaking. And so, so there's a lot of emphasis on compassion. And this is very fascinating, particularly with regard to the Tibetan situation. They actually don't specifically highlight and say, oh, this is Tibetan nationalism. Oh my God, you go and grab this. No. They have very gently integrated Tibetan nationalism. they want these Tibetan kids to grow up to be very loving and kind-hearted individuals. And, I didn't have time to share with you some of the pictures that they drew. So my nationalism really comes from the ground up. It is not something I'm trying to impose on the Tibetan community, or you should call this anti-colonial sort of like, Tibetan nationalism, because that wouldn't be authentic. So really my sort of like nationalism emerges from the experiences of Tibetan children who are being socialized in the current diaspora Tibetan schools. And so that is one thing. And then with regard to Indian nationalism, actually I really learned a lot from Indian nationalism. I read the works of Rabindranath Tagore, who actually spoke at length on nationalism. And what he said really resonated with me very well. He said if he were given a choice to choose between Indian nationalism and humanity at large, he would always choose the humanity. But he said, I'm still a very Indian nationalist. For him, he doesn't want to kind of like undermine the importance of humanity, which is almost transcendental type of nationalism, while you kind of emphasize Indian nationalism. So he was trying to really find a way how these two sort of like, should I say, conceptual constructs could coexist. This transcendental type of, he was actually a scholar who actually, really brought to our attention this issue of nationalism. And I really, for the Tibetans, I think this book is very, very relevant. If you're interested in nationalism, you must read the book written by Rabindranath Tagore's Nationalism. It's a small book. It's only available in India, I'm telling you. I can't find that book in the United States. I checked with vintage bookstores, stuff like I was only able to find here in Khan Market, so I bought the book. Yeah, Khan Market is a bookstore. So it's on Indian nationalism. Rabindranath Tagore, really very, very fascinating scholar. He traveled to so many countries talking about nationalism. And he said, America has this wonderful opportunity because we don't have this baggage from the past. Because it's like a new country, very new. So I'm happy I'm in America. I'm just kidding. So I hope I answered your question, really. Yeah, thank you. Oh, yes.
Sir, the problem of topic you are mentioning is compassionate red nationalism. What I thought is, it seems like more focus on the Buddhism and compassion when you talk about Buddhism. So my question is, when I was reading the last slide, you mentioned like the Tibetans or whatever, they should be a compassionate action because they are displaying of Buddha.
Right.
I think we need to understand it in a broader sense. In the sense like, what about the Tibetan Muslims?
Okay.
How they define the Tibetan nationalism? Something which is very different from what we in the Tibetan school, the major Tibetan school teach. And the schooling structure itself, if you try to analyze them, nationalism and when we talk about secularism, which is something, I don't know, it's a century kind of secularism or whatever. So I think we need to, understand the culture in a plural sense. We should be open. Like we should be ordinary, not a sacred kind of thing. And for example, those who are born in India who stay here, they have a different culture, right? The present culture we have, say it's not folk culture, so it's kind of mass culture. You can say whatever, something like that. Don't you think it should be more open instead of when you talk about it, very inclusive kind, very narrow.
Right.
Thing.
Can I respond to one thing, because I think there's a movie on Tibetan Muslims that has just come out, and the CTA has selected it one of 3 documentary films just in the last 2-3 days.
Yeah, one of my classmates
Kelsang, yeah.
Okay.
So I think seeing that, it's quite interesting. Their ideas of nationalism, identity, nostalgia, and including homesickness, that the word term is used in that film. And in that sense, I think it would transcend religion. So, although it may be a discussion here about Buddhist belief versus Islam or any other, I think what comes out in that movie is very interesting. Sorry, that's just an aside.
I think, you bring up a very, important question, and definitely I will make an attempt in the future to look into that aspect of, Tibetan nationalism. How could it be inclusive of different, religions and whatnot? Of course, I'll definitely pay attention to that. In fact, it wouldn't be very difficult for me, because I teach multiculturalism in America. I teach bilingual education, as to how we can really integrate all this cultural, practices in the schooling process. Is just sort of like my, should I say, forte or something, my interest really. I teach. So I will definitely look into this from a very conceptual perspective. And then, since the majority of Tibetans are kind of like, from those 4 schools or Pen kind of school type. The books that I read, really I didn't come across a book that would talk about our Muslim, brothers, sisters, and how do they identify, with Tibetan nationalism. So, that's a very important facet, of course. And then since altruism itself is very inclusive, it doesn't say that, this is more important than this other individual. So, I think the notion of altruism itself will provide a foundation for all, all Tibetans who might be from Muslim background or Pen background or those 4 schools. I'm sure it will sort of like chart a nice, path forward. Yeah.
You had a question? Yeah. Maybe the last question.
Okay.
Professor, you introduced this very profound idea of altruism-based transcendental nationalism. I'm not certain how practical that will be, but then you went ahead and said that you think the inspiration for middle way approach is altruism. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my thinking is, I think it's completely self-centered, self-interest. It's based on self-interest, because the initial idea was never middle way. It was never genuine autonomy, right? So the middle way was kind of a last resort to tackle the imminent threats that we are having on our identity, such as our culture, our tradition, our religion, and so on. So altruism is never conditioned. It's not like, because this is the thing we have to do. Middle way approach is like a last resort to us. So don't you think the self-interest is the inspiration behind middle way approach?
Well,
instead of altruism.
So altruism is really the principle upon which the middle way approach is based. If you really study this sort of like ideology a little bit in depth, but again here, self-interest may be sort of like an underlying factor. I'm not going to deny that. But more importance is paid to the fact that, we give the interests of the Chinese, counterpart more than the Tibetan interest. That's what I have understood. It's a win-win situation. But otherwise, if you go with this very strong sort of like nationalistic perspective, then it is impossible, to really, in fact, realize the goals of middle way approach. When we come to this middle way approach perspective from an altruistic sort of like, driven ideology, and then, it is really not very difficult to coexist with our Chinese brothers and sisters. In fact, when I asked the children to draw, what it would look like if you were living with Chinese brothers and sisters, would a time ever come? So can you draw? Not only draw, you write something as to what you have drawn. And I was quite amazed that children are far more open-minded. Really, they said yes, we can coexist. We do have a lot of misunderstandings between the Tibetans and Han Chinese. So we all have this responsibility to demystify these misconceptions, misunderstandings. And they say, they say like this, Tibetans and Chinese, we have the same blood type. They think in this very concrete way, we complicate ourselves so much, oh my God, we make life so difficult. But children have this very naive, very beautiful way of looking at things as they exist. So I'm very hopeful of the future, particularly this young generation of Tibetans growing up in the schools, who are being brought up in this very transnational, global kind of like situation, honestly. I mean, when I was growing up, it was, a very different era. But these children are growing up in this internet-driven, global, transnational, and so they have this very different perspective, really. And so I'm very hopeful that I actually, as you said, that this is the best option for us. Really, the best option. Would the nation desire for a state? Of course, definitely. Is there a possibility at this point? It would be very foolish to say there is, honestly. And so, this is the best option I think His Holiness has conceptualized, really. And even if we get this best option materialized, it will be such a beautiful situation. To go back to Tibet, rub the ground, hug the trees, and, go and burn some incense, and hold some, prayer flags, and run around those beautiful mountains and kiss them and hug them. And honestly, it's such a beautiful feeling. I don't know. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to add to that, like Gandhiji's idea about non-violence. I think His Holiness is propounding a middle way approach since 74 now. In a way, the power of that idea, yes, if it has come about,
it is very powerful.
Maybe recognizing the reality and pragmatism and but at the same time, I think the very idea of altruism is that in the end, whether it's being kind to oneself, perhaps also involves being kind to others. So I think sticking to such a larger, bigger kind of an ideology, the power of that in the medium to long term. So I think there again, I would not use self-centered as the driving. If you think about it in a more sort of a, because for instance, even Gandhiji's non-violence idea, there was a time when, maybe that was not the way only for even Indians to go, but then at a certain point, I don't know.
Into self-interest.
Thank you. So thank you to the speaker. Absolutely wonderful, elegant talk, as Jayantiji said, and wonderful research. And to the audience, to Tibet House and the director, Venerable Geshe-la, and all the audience, the staff, everybody, thank you for making time on a Friday evening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thank you, Professor Nawang.
Thank you.
We would now like to request the director of Tibet House, Venerable Geshe-la, to kindly felicitate our one speaker and our esteemed chairperson with this souvenir.
Thank you very much. Perfect. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kishada. A final reminder for those who have not registered their names or email addresses outside, please do so as you leave so that we can notify you if we have any future conferences or lectures. Thank you so much for being a great audience. Thank you.
Thank you.